Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Um, uh, Fairly rare these days on the Remnant, but we have not only a first timer, but someone I don't think I have ever met. I've known of him. I'll often go into saloons and they'll say I've just missed him by a few minutes. But Adam Kirsch is the author of several. I just did it. I had asked you for the right pronunciation, and I get it wrong. Adam Kirsch is the author of several books of poetry and criticism. He's a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow. Kirsch is an editor at the Wall Street Journal Weekend Review section, and he's written a whole bunch of places. And he came out with a book a while back that I wanted to get him on here for a bunch of different reasons, because I'm interested in this stuff and because I wanted to do a show about the topic. And then you may have noticed that that events, dear boy, have gotten in the way for all sorts of things. So today will be a little bit of counter programming. I don't know exactly when this will air, but we're recording on April 9th. So the stock market is only crashing a little bit. But we won't be getting any of that. I just thought listeners should know for context. So, Adam, welcome to the Remnant. And his book. I apologize. That's the greatest sin I could possibly have committed. His book is On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. And I'm sort of fascinated with the fascination with settler colonialism, and it's a great little digestible but cerebral book, very readable. And Adam, we have a rule here with authors of books that the first question is the question that you should always want on your book tour. What's your book about?
Well, hi, Jonah. Thanks very much for having me. Good to meet you in person, virtually at least, if not in real life. And yes, whenever this airs, I have a feeling the Middle East will still be a problem. So,
right.
Unfortunately, the book is just continues to be relevant. So, it's a short book, as you said, and I wrote it in the aftermath of the October 7th Hamas attack, looking not at Israel-Palestine in general or sort of regional politics, which is not my area of knowledge, but specifically about this idea of settler colonialism, because I noticed that after October 7th, when people, academics or student groups or progressive groups, made statements supporting Hamas, which happened in the immediate aftermath, as you might remember if you go back even before the invasion of Gaza and everything that's come since, just sort of as soon as we heard about the attack, which killed 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, there were people who were celebrating it, who were welcoming it, and a lot of the time, people who did that used the term settler colonial to explain why. They said Israel is a settler colonial state, Hamas is resisting settler colonialism. One tweet that I quote in the book said, Israelis are not civilians, they're settlers, meaning there's no such thing as an Israeli civilian who should be off limits. All Israelis are settlers, and therefore they deserve to be killed, or it's fair to kill any of them. And I thought this was a sort of moment where an idea which had been academic and esoteric and something you'd only really hear about in a university had emerged or escaped into general politics, into the wider discourse. And so now it sort of became clear that settler colonialism as an idea was shaping the way people thought about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but also, I think, about American history and about Western civilization generally, because really the idea is about a lot more than just Israel. So what I wanted to do in this short book, which came out last August, is look at what is it that people are talking about when they say settler colonialism. Where does that idea come from? Who are some of the theorists who are behind it? What are the implications it has for understanding history and politics, and in particular the Middle East, and in my view, why it gets them wrong.
Okay, so before I start peppering you with the questions I want to have answered, probably useful for listeners who probably most of whom have heard the phrase by now, but don't necessarily know where it comes from and who's been pushing it. So where does it come from?
Sure. So settler colonialism is an idea that you'll encounter in academia, in the university, in a lot of different contexts. If you look in like a course catalog, you could find courses about settler colonialism everywhere from Native American history to public health to gender studies, environmental studies. There are all different ways that this idea gets applied. But essentially what it is I describe it in the book as a critical theory based on the fact that, based on the sort of history of European settlement and colonization. So the idea is that a country that is founded by European conquest and settlement, and originally that meant Australia, the United States, and Canada, which are the places where this theory was most developed and is probably still most popular. That to understand the history of these countries, you have to look at them from the point of view of the original settlement and colonization. And if you want to capture this idea in a nutshell, I think there's a sentence from the Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe, who is one of the people who did the most to sort of establish this as an academic field and to popularize it, who wrote in the 1990s that in settler colonialism, it means that settlement is a process, not an event, or rather more accurate to say invasion is a process, not an event. So when he says invasion is a process, not an event, he was thinking first of all about the British invasion of Australia. So you might think that that's something that happened in 1788, in the late 18th, early 19th century, and that Australia today is sort of separate from that. That's an event in history, and it's over and done with. But he's saying settlement or invasion or colonization, we should think of it not as an event that happened in the past, but that everything that happens in these countries down to the present day continues the process of settlement and colonization. And one of the implications of that is that everyone, just to talk about America, because that's where we are, everyone in America who's not a Native American, who's not descended from indigenous people who were here before 1492, is a settler. And that sort of flies in the face of the way we usually use the term settler or colonist in American history. We talk about the American colonies as things that existed before the American Revolution, and then they stopped being colonies and became states, or the country, the United States. And when people come to this country, over the last 250 years, they've been coming as immigrants. They're immigrating to a country that exists. But viewed through this lens of settler colonialism, you would say, and a lot of people do say, there's no such thing as an immigrant. All that you can be in North America is a settler. Either you're a settler who came here early or you're a settler who came here later. But whenever you came here, you're in a place that sort of isn't yours, never can be yours, and that you're always essentially occupying or usurping. And that is a sort of basic reorientation of the way that we usually think about American history, and it generates a lot of critiques of American institutions and society that are different and in a lot of ways more profoundly hostile than I think most people are used to.
So I am, long-time listeners know, I like one of my various obsessions is how I think intellectuals have a habit of thinking that ideas drive history, right? I mean, I'm one of them. I like intellectual history a great deal. Richard Weaver's, when Richard Weaver said, ideas have consequences in a book called Ideas Have Consequences. And, there's that great quote from Keynes about, long dead economists shaping the world, and all that. I get it. And I think it's sometimes true. George Will says small ideologically committed groups move the wheels of history. And I think that's true. Also, small ideological committed groups disappear like a fart in a rainstorm because they weren't successful.
Right.
There's a real winner's bias to a lot of those stories. The point is, if I take a step back and I look at the settler colonialism idea, which I gather basically really kicks off in the 90s, right? I mean, it goes back to the 60s. It has roots in Franz Fanon, and we can talk about that and all that. But it seems to be like this new exciting idea in the 90s, more or less, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the 90s and then in the next couple of decades becoming a sort of well-established academic idea.
Yeah. And so the issue I have is I think that sometimes what you get in American or intellectual history more broadly is you get nascent, inchoate, but real movements that cast about for an idea or a paradigm to justify what they want to do anyway. And if you just sort of take a little bit of a step back from settler colonial theory, it's not that different from like a lot of the cultural Marxism of the 1960s, or the Howard Zinn stuff. You know, it is a way of coming up with a new argument about how Western civilization is bad or America is bad. And I agree with you that this idea of perpetual original sin, which, you know, you tie a little bit to Calvinism, which I think is interesting, is it's a little new, but I bet you if I spent 20 minutes, you know, or 2 hours looking for, you know, the Frankfurt School kind of crowd, talking about, you know, how white Americans today are guilty of, you know, because they inherit the benefits of their whiteness, or the, you know, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
You could find examples of that as well. And so I guess the first question I have is how much of it is pretextual, and how much of it actually leads any of these settler colonial theorists to conclusions that are politically inconvenient for them, right? Because that's the test. It's like, are you going to attack the Chinese for what they're doing in Tibet, you know, or Xinjiang or wherever? Or is it only really another one of these cudgels to go after the same targets the left types have always wanted to go after?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of I say in the book that in practical terms, on practical political issues, when people are settler colonial theorists, they probably have a lot of the same goals in mind as other kinds of progressives who don't speak the language of settler colonialism. But there are important differences. There are differences in terms of the starting point and also where you end up. So I think you're right to point to a sort of affinity with critical theory that started as a Marxist sort of critique of Western culture, and critical race theory, which talk about whiteness and about the centrality of sort of race and slavery in American history. Those are also critical theories, and they are also sort of aimed at Western institutions and civilization, trying to uncover, you know, what is the profound basis of what's wrong with them, essentially. But I think that if you say that the profound basis of what's wrong with them is the settlement of North America, for example, that leads to different conclusions than if you say that, as people often say, the original sin of America is slavery. If you say the original sin of America is slavery, then that means that the legacy of slavery and racism is sort of the most important injustice, or the most important thing that you have to know to understand America. If you say that settlement and colonization are the most important thing, it in a way reduces the scope of possible improvement, of possible hope, because you could at least, I mean, critical race theory sort of argues that it is structurally impossible for America to overcome racism. But other ways of looking at America's racial history have foregrounded the idea of progress, or of living up to our original promises. Like Martin Luther King said that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, was a promissory note that had never been paid. And so there's a way of looking at American history through that lens and saying America was founded as a country that's about equality, and it was never truly equal. And therefore, as we move towards equality, we are participating in making the country what it should be, right? That's sort of a liberal creed that was sort of an official establishment idea, I'd say, for the last 75 years. Presidents of both parties spoke in those terms. But if you say that where things went wrong for America is that Europeans should never have discovered North America, which is what some of the people that I'm writing about say quite directly, that means that really there's no direction of improvement. There's nothing that you can concretely do to atone for or to remedy that original sin. And in a quite deliberate way, I think people who talk about settler colonialism want to convict America, and also Canada and Australia, sort of in a completely inescapable and thoroughgoing way, of being founded on evil, being founded specifically on genocide. And that to the extent that we're all benefiting from these countries, that we live here and we enjoy their prosperity, that we are also benefiting from genocide, and really in a way continuing the genocide. So that is a much more hostile and, in a strange way, impractical way of thinking about these countries, because there is no way that you can concretely decolonize the United States, right? If you were to say, well, what would be the remedy for this? If you were fighting colonialism in Algeria, the remedy was you take the power and property back from the 10% of the population who are European settlers and send them back to Europe. And that's essentially what happened in Algeria after it won independence. But you can't do that in the United States, where 98% of the population is not indigenous, right? It comes from somewhere else, whether their ancestors came here on the Mayflower or 2 weeks ago, you're not indigenous. So when you talk about decolonizing North America, you're not really talking about a political program. And settler colonialism can't really be the basis of a mass political movement in the way that Marxism could, right? Communism was a mass political movement because it said 2% of the people, 1% of the people hold all the power and the wealth, and we are going to take it from them. And that's what Occupy Wall Street said in the early 2010s, that we represent the 99%. Settler colonialism really inverts those proportions. It says the 98% are guilty of a crime against the 2%, or the ancestors of the 2%. How do you atone for that? How do you remedy it? As a result, I think most of the people who write about this are not talking about ways to help Native Americans. This is not really a Native American advocacy cause. And one of the things I say in the book is that Native American advocacy groups don't talk about settler colonialism. They don't say our goal is to decolonize the United States. They say our goal is to hold the U.S. government to treaty obligations and ensure that our rights are followed.
Get better mineral rights and electrification and like normal human desires.
Right, and tribal control over law enforcement and things like that, education. This is really a way of talking and thinking that appeals to the settlers, to people who think of themselves as settlers, and it's a way for them to explain what's wrong with our society. Why is it that we are destroying the environment? Why do we have income inequality? Why do we have patriarchy? Anything that, and these are, as you said, things that progressives of all different stripes might agree are problems. But the settler colonial answer is these are legacies of settler colonialism, and that what decolonization means is that we have to change our society in ways that get rid of and atone for these settler legacies, both in politics and economics and institutions, and also in a more sort of spiritual or psychological sense in ourselves. And there's a term that I talk about called settler ways of being that's used a lot, which is really a sort of, it's sort of a synonym for a sin or a moral weakness. What are the things about you that are bad? Greed, alienation, exploitation, taking advantage of privilege, taking your privileges for granted. All of these can be seen as settler ways of being. So by framing things in terms of settlerdom, you sort of have this Manichaean zero-sum game where everyone who's a settler needs to purge themselves, right? They're in the wrong. And the people who are most willing to acknowledge their guilt, to acknowledge the settler ways of being, are the moral vanguard. They're the people who have the most moral prestige. And so one of the things I say in the book is that, as in evangelical Christianity, you might say, I am a sinner, and in doing that, you actually gain spiritual prestige, right? Because you're saying, we're all sinners, but I know that I'm a sinner, and therefore that's where grace begins. That's sort of the Puritan Calvinist idea, that you start by recognizing that you are born into sin. Similarly, people who say, I am a settler, as some people do in their author IDs or even in their ex bios, that's a way of saying, I acknowledge that I am guilty of this settler ways of being, that I've inherited settler privileges. And
the land acknowledgement stuff is sort of part of this too, right?
Definitely. I mean, I think the most public form of this, the one that until recently at least was where you were most likely to encounter it in real life, is the land acknowledgement. And that's something that really went from being completely unknown in the U.S. in, say, maybe 2018, and is now, or at least until recently, was very universal at every sort of university, arts institution, museum, cultural institution. A lot of local governments have these things that are called land acknowledgements, and a land acknowledgement is a formula, a verbal formula, a statement where the entity acknowledges that it occupies or inhabits land that once belonged to a certain native people. And you name the native people. So you'll see these on like university websites. Sometimes they're recited at public events, or on the wall, displayed on the wall somewhere. And what it really is a sort of public statement of the basic principle that whoever is on this land now, whether it's in a university or a museum, it's not really ours. It's not really our land. Really, in some sort of basic fundamental sense, it has always been and always will be the land of the native people who were here before Europeans or Americans arrived. And some of these land acknowledgements will go sort of further in the direction of apology or guilt and say, we are benefiting from their dispossession, or our occupation of this land is an act of privilege. Others are more restrained and just sort of say we honor them as the the traditional custodians or the guardians of this land. But the effect is to sort of say, the most important thing you need to know about this institution is that it is here as a result of an invasion of a crime, and in some basic moral sense doesn't deserve to be here or shouldn't be here. That we're sort of strangers here. We're not the real sovereigns, the real inhabitants. And it's a peculiar idea, not because it's not historically accurate, because of course it is historically accurate. Everyone who knows American history, and that I think starting in elementary school, knows that before Europeans arrived in North America, there were Native Americans all over the continent, and that over the course of hundreds of years, the United States and Canada expanded from east to west and conquered the land and dispossessed people, and in many cases killed them, and reduced them to reservations. Those are all historical facts, and I think undisputed by anyone. What's new is the idea that when you have a meeting, or you have a building, or you have an institution, that the first thing you need to do is to say these things about it, to say this is the most important truth that we have to acknowledge. And someone who, after I'd written the book, someone wrote to me with what I thought was an interesting observation, which is that in the 19th century, if you would have a public meeting in America, you would start with a Christian prayer. You would start with an invocation. You get a minister to deliver an invocation, as still sometimes happens, in Congress. People give a prayer before the session of Congress. This is sort of an equivalent. It's sort of saying, this isn't a statement of our moral beliefs, of what we think is the most important moral belief for us to share publicly. And as I said, that's something that has gone from zero to everywhere very quickly, I think without a lot of reflection or consensus. And it represents a real change in the way that people think about America and its history.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm a big fan of Thomas Holland's book Dominion, and part of his argument is that we are all still standing on the shoulders of Christianity, even the most secular atheist people. The constructs of how we think about issues are still so profoundly Christian. And, so the most secular atheist, agnostic, whatever, human rights activist, the whole idea of conscience rights, of human rights, of free speech, right? You can't take the Christianity out of it as a matter of historicity, right? It just, because that's where it came from, and you may not like it, you may find it embarrassing, but for Christianity, we would have a different set of ideas here, and we might still have a lot more blood sports, or who knows, right?
Sure.
And the degree to which I see that more and more since I read that book, in so much of these. I mean, I was always a fan of Eric Vergelen and the political religion stuff, even though he pulled back that a little bit later in life. And Michael Burley has picked that up as a sort of a theme of his writing about how a lot of the ideological wars of the 20th century were really the wars of religion by other means, or I should say the 19th and 20th century. And this is just, it feels like the expiation of guilt, the concepts of original sin, and also, and I don't mean this to be offensive to any of my Christian brethren, but a certain amount of hubristic piety, that, a holier than thou righteousness that used to manifest itself on the left as being prolier than thou. And now it's feeling guiltier than thou, which was ironically the thesis of James Burnham's Suicide of the West, which is that the West is being undone by a riot of guilt and self-loathing by Western liberalism. And this just seems like another sort of expression of that in a lot of ways. All right, so we should move to Israel, but I guess the linchpin between these two things or these two subjects is, but for Israel, do you think this? I mean, I'm not saying the idea would not have materialized at all, because there was always there was always a deep shame for understandable reasons, legitimate reasons, about what happened to the Aborigines in Australia, the natives in America and Canada. And America did some absolutely horrendous things. I think that's absolutely indisputably true. What makes them, I would argue, historically notable, much like slavery, isn't that a nation state did these things. It's that for countries like the United States, it was so hypocritical. right? Because of our principles and our ideals, we were violating something that the Vikings had no principles to violate. Of course, you
Right.
killed your enemies and took their stuff, right?
Right.
But all that said, would this idea have basically stayed in some containment vessels in a few labs and a few English departments, in history departments, but for the existence of Israel? By which I mean is it really demonstrating my point that people grab ideas off the shelf that they can use as weapons for something they want to do anyway, which is in this case go after Israel?
Yeah, well, I do think that you can see Israel in this discourse from the very beginning. Patrick Wolf wrote about Israel. Another one of his sort of seminal papers about this was called Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, in which he talked about North America and Israel and Palestine as examples of eliminating a native people. So Israel has always figured largely in this discourse, and really in a strange way been way overrepresented when you look at how disproportionate it is between, say, the population of Israel and the population of the United States, or the amount of area that we're talking about, or the land. That all that has always been there. But I think it's definitely true that since 2023, what's been happening in Israel has enabled these ideas to gain a much wider hearing. That they've become much more popular on social media and in protests and in the way that people sort of frame their thought. And it's an interesting question about, do ideas drive behavior, or is it that we sort of look for ideas to justify the things that we wanted to do anyway? I don't know. It's hard to determine, but I do think that
I think historically it's a both and rather
yeah,
than an either or.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there's some cases where it's obvious the idea is more important, and there are other cases where it's obvious that, like, I don't know, the free silver movement,
yeah,
anything, all the highfalutin arguments from Jennings Bryan or whoever, those are pretextual to the fact that the farmers wanted to get off the gold standard,
right,
and
right.
that was an interest driving ideas rather than ideas driving interests.
Sure.
That's what I mean.
Well, so I think that for a lot of people who are interested, for a lot of people who are very passionately interested in Israel Palestine in the United States, there are two reasons. One is because they have a personal connection to one of the two peoples, right? If you're Jewish, you have a connection to Israel. If you're Palestinian, you have a connection to Palestine, or maybe Muslim or Arab more broadly, you have a personal connection to Palestine, and you feel that you're involved in this conflict. But I think that there's also a lot of people who have made themselves involved in it and have taken a great interest in it, partly because of the sort of graphic suffering, the terrible suffering that's happening right now, or has been happening over the last 18 months in Gaza, which has angered a lot of people, and understandably so. But also because settler colonialism in the United States or in Canada or in Australia is sort of theoretical. It's about the distant past, and you can't really imagine fighting settler colonialism or destroying it in these countries. But in Israel, you have an example of a small, recently founded country where people have been fighting to destroy it since it was created. And so that is sort of like the laboratory, the experimental test ground where people are actually fighting settler colonialism. So when you move from theory to practice, you can say Palestine is the place where all of these ideas about settler colonialism are actually being tested. They're being fought for with guns and bombs, and not just with speeches or textbooks. And so it's exciting. And I think that one of the most interesting and sort of suggestive things about the pro-Hamas reaction to October 7th was that a lot of people said that they found it exciting and energizing. That one person in a tweet that was quoted a lot said, "You taught us about decolonization. Did you think that decolonization meant papers? That you do it with papers? No, you do it with guns and bombs." That is like, it's like, this is the real thing. This is where it's really happening. And in that sense, I would compare it to the way that student radicals in the US in the 1960s sort of embraced Maoist China or North Vietnam, not because they actually knew a lot about what was going on there, and certainly not because they intended to go there themselves or wanted to be there, but because they had a worldview which is the most important evil, the worst thing in the world is American imperialism. These are the people who are fighting American imperialism. Therefore, they are on the right side of history, and we should support them. And I think there's a similar chain of reasoning that leads people who are progressives or who call themselves progressives in the US to say, Settler colonialism is the root of all the problems in the world. Israel is a settler colonial society. Therefore, everyone who's fighting settler colonialism is on the right side, and Hamas is sort of objectively on the right side of history. And that's, I think, how you get to these strange scenes of people like progressive student protesters waving Hamas flags or saying, embracing Hamas symbols or Hezbollah flags, not because they actually know anything about Hamas or even fully realize that it is an Islamic fundamentalist movement that shares zero goals with American progressives on anything, and certainly not on issues of gender or sexuality, say, but because Hamas is fighting Israel and Israel is the face of settler colonialism, therefore Hamas is on the right side. It's the side we want to be on. So yes. I think ideas do shape people's political behavior in surprising ways.
So, I mean, my skepticism about that, I mean, I take all your points, and you're the one who's been up close with all this, but, you know, and I think you're absolutely right. Actually, you guys at the Journal had that great op-ed early on where they did this polling or focus groups of protester, college kids who were protesting, and asked them, like, what sea are people talking about from river to the sea? And people are saying the Caribbean, and that kind of
definitely. Stuff. There's not much knowledge. There's a lot of passion, but not much knowledge.
Yeah. So I stipulate all of that. The thing where I wrote about this a while ago. If you take the structural racism or institutional racism arguments seriously on their own terms, right? A big chunk of those arguments are about how disproportionate outcomes can be inferred to be proof of structural inequities and bigotries and whatever, right? And one of the reasons why this movement gets started is precisely because it was getting more and more difficult for lawyers to find proof of actual racism or sexism in terms of intentional conduct. So they started looking for institutional explanations for why they were getting disparate results. Fine. By that logic, it is indisputable to me that the United Nations is anti-Semitic, is structurally anti-Semitic. Just because if you look at the outcomes of denunciations and condemnations and all of that, they have one standard for Israel and a different one for everybody else. And you can say, well, it's just the standard for Zionists, and Zionists just happen to be Jews. But you've heard all these arguments before. Similarly, we hear, like I grew up, I'm a little older than you. I grew up with people obsessed about the racism of our apartheid South Africa. Perfectly legitimate thing to be offended by. I'm not arguing that I liked apartheid by any stretch of the imagination. But and today, we still, all the rhetoric about Jim Crow 2.0 and all of these sorts of things, there is this burning desire to fight racism. But it needs to be racism by basically white European people. And so China is, in effect, a Jim Crow country. If you are not ethnically Han, you're a second-class citizen, sometimes worse than a second-class citizen. You can't get into certain universities. Some ethnic groups can't get internal passports to go find jobs in cities. They can't do all sorts of things. Zero outrage here, right? The people who scream about the cultural genocide or actual genocide of Israel, which is a very hard case to make. Certainly the actual genocide part is a hard case to make. You don't see a huge amount of overlap in the Venn diagram with the people who are outraged by China's conduct towards Tibet, towards Hong Kong, towards threatening Taiwan. You don't see the similar amount of outrage about Russia's adventures in Georgia to Ukraine, and so my point is that a lot of it still feels more pretextual than the description that you're giving, just insofar as, like, if your point is that, and I know that it's not your position, just to be fair, right? But if your point is that they feel like Israel is like the Spanish Civil War kind of in the 1930s, the place where it's all going down, so let's have this fight there. The Israelis who live in Israel, they are only metaphorically still settlers anymore, much like the Americans here. The Russians in Ukraine are actually settlers. They are actually colonial occupier settlers. The Chinese in Tibet are committing true genocidal, cultural genocidal attacks. And there's very little complaint about that. So it does feel like it is still to some extent, an exercise in Western self-loathing, where Israelis code as white European Westerners, even though that's misleading. And it's an extension of those kinds of passions rather than, we get to apply this paradigm accurately.
Well, that's definitely true. I mean, maybe you could say that about any kind of ideas, that it's never applied with full consistency, but certainly not in this case. I mean, there are some theorists and historians who will say you can find lots of examples of settler colonialism throughout the world and throughout history, and look at it in a comparative way. If you want to sort of take it to the extreme, the idea that one people would conquer another, take their land, and settle it is sort of the story of humanity forever.
Right.
And there's no country on earth that, if you don't go back far enough, that's how it started. Right. Every single country in the world started that way. Every empire. And so you could look at any place on the map and say, in England, the Angles and the Saxons were settler colonials in the 5th century. It's just a question of how long ago it happened. And it's also true.
Right, the last Saxon king was 1066, right? But because those damn Norsemen were settler colonialists.
Yes.
Yeah.
So all that is definitely true. I think that the reason why it's not sort of impartially applied is there are a couple of reasons. One is that people are mostly concerned with their own society. They're concerned with criticizing or reforming or directing their attention at my society. What am I responsible for? The country where I live. And so for Americans, that means America. And for Canadians, it means Canada. I think that is understandable. It doesn't lead to, complete historical accuracy or impartiality, but it's a question of what do I feel responsible for? And especially if you think of this as a critical theory, the people you criticize are your people, the people who you feel that you have some affiliation with or identification with. So again, there was no sort of objective case to make that the United States was a worse country or worse place than the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but still plenty of people on the American left thought that it's much more important to criticize America, partly because we are American, right? America is where we are and we can affect it. I think that's part of the answer. And part of the answer with Israel is that, and it's a lot of protest groups would say, America does have this uniquely close relationship with Israel. And so if you pressure America, you could see that resulting in changing Israeli behavior, because America provides so much, military support and diplomatic support, so that you could sort of pressure people here, pressure politicians here in the U.S., and it will translate into change in Israel. It hasn't so far, but that's at least a sort of political case for it. I think that if you were to sort of dig deeper, there are two less sort of creditable answers here. One is that it's easier to imagine changing or eliminating a small country than a big country. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm old enough to remember that the Free Tibet movement used to be a very big fashionable cause, in the 1980s and 90s. Lots of celebrities would say Free Tibet in a similar way to the way people now
when China was weak.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can't really imagine defeating China or making China change its behavior by way of protest, and eventually that cause sort of disappeared and no one really talks about it very much anymore. With Israel, you have a small country that's surrounded by hostile powers, and so it's much easier to imagine actually getting rid of it. And so you say the people who are there now are no longer settlers, and that's certainly true for almost everyone biographically. I mean, there are immigrants who came after the fall of the Soviet Union or even more recently, but the original Zionist pioneers who started coming there in the 1880s, their families have been there for 3, 4, 5 generations. So it's true they're not settlers. But one of the things that the idea of settler colonialism does is it says a settler is not something you do, it's an identity. It's an inherited identity. So even if you are not the one who settled, you have inherited the status of settler from your ancestors, and you are responsible for it just as they were. So one of the interesting ways that this plays out in the case of Israel is that before settler colonialism sort of became a thing, people often use the term settler in the Israeli context, and they meant one specific thing by it, which is Israeli Jews living on the West Bank.
Right.
And those people were settlers because the West Bank, the occupied territories, or Judea and Samaria, depending on what you call them, are not legally recognized as part of Israel under international law. They were never formally annexed. So when Israeli Jews go live there, they're called settlers to distinguish them from citizens of Israel.
Right.
So they're in a place where theoretically they might eventually have to leave in order to create a Palestinian state, or those are the settlers. But on October 7th, the people who were killed were not those settlers. They were people in a part of the country and part of Israel that is part of Israel by any definition. So if you say that those people are also settlers, you're sort of abolishing any distinction between Israel and occupied territory. You're saying all of it is occupied territory. The Israeli Jews don't have a right to any of that territory. And that is exactly what is implied by the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So I think that there are a lot of people who do really think that Israel can be destroyed and hope that it will be, and that the results of that will be either that Jews and Arabs still live there together, but under a non-Jewish government in a binational state of some kind, or that the Jews will leave or be killed. I think that is the sort of end goal for a lot of people in the Arab world, and for some progressives as well, to say these are people who are settlers, they're colonialists, they shouldn't be there, they should go back where they came from. And people say that sort of casually, meaning, maybe Germany or Poland, or, they don't really care where it is, just not there. Or the sort of more violent version of that is they'll be pushed into the sea, which means murder. So I think that the effect of seeing Israel as a settler colonial country is delegitimization. It's saying this is a country that should never have been created, it shouldn't exist, and anyone who's fighting to make it not exist is on the right side, they're doing the right thing.
Which is, it gets very frustrating when you get in the weeds in some of this stuff, insofar as if you look at like the birthdays of most of the nations in the United Nations or in the world, right? The Middle East has a couple really ancient countries, like Egypt. Like Egypt and China right now are arguing about who's the most ancient, thing. Let them have that fight. That's fine. But Israel is older. Modern Israel, like 1948 Israel, is older than a lot of nation states in the world, in Africa and in the Middle East, right? Because the nation state concept is not that new, not that old. But it's. I think you make a very good point about the sort of logic of the cancer cell for the word settler has migrated now that they're all settlers. It bothers me greatly, this idea that settler. I have a huge problem with identity politics, generally speaking, including right these days. There's a lot of crazy ass right wing identity politics going on.
Sure.
But one of the first defenses of identity politics that I would ever offer is that if you choose something to be your identity, that's a stronger argument for that identity than somebody imposing it on you without your permission and without your acknowledgement and agreement.
Sure. Yeah.
And to sort of just willy-nilly say that 330 million Americans who aren't of Native American descent are settlers, and that's their identity.
Yeah.
That's, never mind anybody in Israel who's not, Muslim or Arab, is a settler, then that is a dehumanization trick rather than an actual serious good faith argument of any kind. When you categorize people as a class of people that they don't even necessarily agree to, and then say the world would be better off without that class of people, whether it's billionaires or homeless people or illegal immigrants or any of these kinds of things, when you start treating people as interchangeable commodities or categories for the purpose of public policy, you're going down a bad path. And that's the vibe that I get off of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Absolutely. It is dehumanizing. You saw that after October 7th. It's dehumanizing to say people are settlers, because what it means is they're legitimate targets of violence. And also what it means is we should not have to have any sympathy for them. Right. And you see that in a lot of the ways that pro-Palestinian protesters have talked about October 7th, right? They mock it, they jeer at it. There was a lot of, at the very beginning, sort of adopting gliders as a symbol because some of the Hamas terrorists came in on gliders. there was a protest that disrupted this memorial exhibit to people who were killed at the Nova Music Festival, where a lot of Israeli civilians were killed. And there was a traveling exhibition when it came to New York. There were protesters who sort of disrupted it and tried to destroy it. Yes, all of that is dehumanizing, and it's a way of saying these are people who we don't have to care about their existence, their lives, what will happen to them. They're the enemy. Anything that happens to them, they deserve it. It's coming to them. With America, I think it creates a real political problem that no one in America, I mean, like virtually no one in America would say, I am a settler. That's
Right.
not a recognized political term. And one of the things, in fact, that makes settler colonial theorists, certain ones, very angry is precisely that. It's the failure of people to recognize that they are settlers. So another term that's used in this field sometimes is settler moves to innocence, which are ways that you say, well, I can't be a settler. My parents have been here my family's been here for 200 years, or I'm not a settler. I never took anyone's land. Those are all settler moves to innocence. It's a way of saying, I personally didn't do it, so how can I be guilty for it? But of course, structurally, if you see things in these structural terms, you're saying, structurally, we're all settlers, and therefore we all share this responsibility. One of the interesting sort of sub-debates in this is, if your ancestors came to America as slaves from Africa, are you a settler? And there are people who will say, yes, definitely, you're a settler because you're not indigenous. And even though your ancestors didn't choose to come here, now that you're here, you benefit from a settler colonial society, and therefore you are a settler. There are people who will say, when there was an idea for reparations for slavery, and that emancipated slaves should be given 40 acres and a mule, that was basically saying, we're going to take stolen native land and give it to you as a reparation. And so it was just another act of theft, another act of settlement. That's one of the ways in which this way of thinking about American history, cuts against a lot of our usual divisions of left and right, or different group identities, because the idea of being a settler is so comprehensive that in the end, almost everyone falls into it.
So it isn't part of the. I mean, it's funny. It's like I'm not talking about the serious academic literature. I'm not saying this isn't a worthy thing for you to be writing about. I'm glad that you did. But at a very basic political level, isn't this sort of profoundly stupid? I'm not saying the arguments themselves. I'm just saying that, it's sort of like it's like, I don't know, at least apocryphally, the Shakers didn't have sex, right?
Right.
If you're going to come up with a proselytizing religion that you want to rack up big numbers, that's probably not the one to go with.
Sure.
Right? Similarly, if you're trying to get mass sympathy for people, for a movement, picking one that says you should cheer and celebrate when little kids are murdered in front of their parents, and that peacenik hippie girls are raped, gang raped, and all of the terrible things of October 7th, and that everybody who doesn't do land acknowledgements is a profound sinner and a cultural oppressor and rapist. This is not the kind of ideology that can scale up beyond the seminar room. And yet it catches on. Mimetically, it catches on, which just seems, if you really care about Gazans, wouldn't you, or Palestinians, where the grown-ups in the room say, hey guys, there are different arguments to be made than this one.
Sure. I mean, yes, I think it's definitely a self-limiting idea. It's not an idea that you could build a mass political movement on. It is an idea that limits itself to an elite. And I think that's exactly what we've seen, is that it appeals to certain groups who see themselves as a vanguard, as an elite vanguard. And that's one reason why it's more popular in universities, for example. But I think that if you look at the record of pro-Palestinian protest over the last 18 months, it's a very poor record, right? It has not accomplished any of its goals. It hasn't changed American policy. It hasn't really changed anything that's happening in Israel. It hasn't made people in Gaza suffer any less. So I think you could say that it was a failed protest movement. But that doesn't mean, the failure of the movement eventually will turn off most people, but not absolutely everyone. There will always be some people who say, well, we need renewed dedication. We need to be more aggressive. That's sort of the cycle of radicalization. That's how you end up with these radical splinter groups. And so I don't think that the kinds of things that pro-Palestinian protesters have done to get attention have succeeded in winning over public opinion, but maybe they have succeeded in gaining attention for the cause, forcing people to acknowledge that this cause exists, reminding people of it. One of the great strategic failures of that cause, you could say, was the way that it turned off so many Arab American voters against Kamala Harris, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a phenomenon where a lot of Arab American voters were very angry about Biden's policy in Gaza, said we won't vote for a Democrat, we won't vote for Harris because that's voting for genocide. And in the process, the alternative was Trump, who's turned out to be even less sympathetic to their goals. So yes, it's not practical politics, it's ideology. And as we know, ideology leads people to counterproductive extremes.
Well, so on that point, it's funny. It just occurs to me that, like, we haven't hit our Frantz Fanon quota or anything like that here, which I lament. And, but there was a generation of, I should say generation. There was a small group of radicals, white radicals raised in relative privilege in the 1960s and 70s, who were ensorcelled to a similar but slightly different set of ideas, and they actually committed themselves to radical, violent measures. The Weathermen, you can go down to the Baader Meinhof gang, all of those kinds of things. It's interesting that, knock on wood, we haven't seen any of that. If you take the principles of the settler colonialism thing seriously, and I take your point about how if you reject liberal politics, and I mean this sort of, like liberal democratic politics, as just the edifice of settler colonialism, then you don't actually care about winning bourgeois political arguments.
Yeah.
I get all that, right? So your point is a good one about how it serves a different purpose for creating martyrs and self-radicalization and all that kind of stuff. And yet, and I have to say this in this way, to their credit, you haven't seen these grad students strapping on suicide vests and doing crazy violent things, even though if they were going to follow the actual logic of their radical chic ideas, that's what they should be doing, right? If they're willing to defend the indigenous people to do this, shouldn't they, in a riot of expiating their own sin, being willing to use the same tactics?
Yeah, I think even in the 1960s, you didn't see very much of that in the United States. You saw a few, the Weathermen, or a few like Symbionese Liberation Army type people, but they were very few in number and a radical fringe. And I think the big difference is that in the 1960s and 70s, if you were protesting the Vietnam War, you were protesting a war that you as an American could end up being drafted into. And so there was at least some personal existential involvement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also true of Frantz Fanon and Algeria. The FLN, they're fighting for their country, in their country, and so are maybe willing to commit atrocities. And the FLN committed atrocities just like Hamas did, of massacring civilians in the name of national liberation. But you're not going to, it's very difficult to do that, to get yourself to the point of doing that for a cause that you're not directly involved in, that doesn't affect you personally, even if you sympathize with it. The exception has been, I think there have been 2 people in the United States who immolated themselves, who set themselves on fire and died in order to protest the genocide in Gaza, what they call the genocide in Gaza. And it's it was very sad to witness, because obviously a person who does that out of extreme moral passion and concern and loathing of violence. But one of the reasons why it's sad to witness is that it's very clear from history that doesn't accomplish anything. There were people before the Holocaust who killed themselves demonstratively in public in order to warn the world, this is what's going on. This is what's going to happen to German Jews. There was a story that I think almost no one knows about or remembers today. There was a Jewish Czech, I think, Jew who went onto the floor of the League of Nations in Geneva in like 1936 or 7 and shot himself on the floor of the League of Nations in front of all the delegates to protest Nazi Germany. And not only did it not do anything, it wasn't even entered into the minutes of the session. So it's natural to think, what is the most extreme thing I can do? What can I give to show how seriously I care about this cause? And it would be to give your life. But the truth is that makes very little impression on people. Really what makes impression on people is threatening their lives, threatening their interests. That's what people listen to. Maybe one parallel to this is that you're talking about how there hasn't been very much actual violence in this movement, and I think that's true. In a strange way, American politics as a whole has gotten much more violent in its language and rhetoric without much real violence to accompany it.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, thank God, and let's hope it stays that way. But it does almost seem as though, maybe because of the internet, that there's this deep disconnect between what people say and what they are willing to say they think and feel, and what they will actually do. So you could say that there's been less social disruption in the last 10 years than in the 60s, certainly. Less actual violence, less actual social disruption. Even though people are constantly talking about civil war and the breakdown of the country and fascism and all these things that you would think you would mean that everything's falling to pieces, in practical terms, they're not. So I wonder if maybe we're used to saying things at a louder pitch online than we actually mean.
Yeah, no, we can only hope that that's the case, right?
Yes.
I mean, part of the problem is, like, mass school shootings were not a thing,
right?
And then they were a thing, and then
yes.
it becomes this mimetic contagion issue, and blah 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 blah. But yeah, I mean, like, it is sort of striking to have a group that, at a very high level of theory, endorses violence and does not see a distinction between citizens and military combatants, and endorses terrorism. I mean, I don't think there's any way of getting around that, right? And yet, you've not seen, and the Trump administration is trying to say these people are all pro-terrorism and therefore they're terrorists and yada yada.
Yeah.
Like the free speech issues kind of matter to me on that point. That's how I should ask. So this book came out last August, and last August it felt like you can make a pretty accurate straight line projection about where these ideas were going, where these protests were going, that it was going to be this long simmering problem for the left, that universities were going to further beclown and marginalize themselves by indulging this stuff too much and having, again, what I would argue is sort of a structurally anti-Semitic kind of approach to what kind of protest gets free speech treatment and what kind doesn't. And then the Trump administration comes in, and much to the pleasure of a lot of friends of mine, including me to a certain extent, does a whole bunch of things with universities. Now, process issues are important, and we'll see where it all goes. But, like, rarely have institutions brought the trouble they've gotten on themselves more obviously than this stuff.
Yeah.
Presumably, you didn't think that was coming. What happens to these ideas institutionally, politically, now going forward?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. I don't know. I think that we haven't seen the end of it. We're only seeing the beginning of it right now. I think that what the Trump administration has done very effectively is change the incentives for university administrators. In the past, the university administrators had no incentive to antagonize the faculty or students by shutting them down or complaining about what was being taught or ending protests. People who did try to do that, like the president of Columbia, ended up losing their jobs. So there was no incentive to really take a hard line on these issues. Now the incentives have changed, and there is a strong incentive to take a hard line on these issues. And so I think you're going to see university policies change, certainly about things like protests and masking and students occupying buildings, things that would have been sort of winked at before. But what kind of response that will create among faculty and students, what the next step will be, it's not clear. And of course, all these things are not happening in isolation. They're happening at the same time as events in the world, events in the Middle East, economic things here, all kinds of disruption and uncertainty. So I think we probably haven't seen the last of this kind of radical protest, and who knows what kind of form it'll end up taking.
Yeah, that just reminds me of a question I meant to ask you earlier. Chronology is a white heteronormative, impulse anyway, so who cares? Again, I'm a big believer that there are very few new ideas, that there are very few new things. That we briefly touched on the fact that political violence 50 years ago was so much worse than it is today. Which, and again, I'm not trying to wish in worse political violence, so all that kind of stuff. But like, I mean, I've written about this a bunch of times. The head of the FBI described San Francisco as, in like 1976, I want to say, as the Belfast of North America. You had, in an 18-month period, I want to say from like late 70 to early 72, somewhere in there, something like 5 domestic bombings a day in the United States. Now, they weren't all fatal, but a lot of it was just property, but that matters. And you had all this just crazy string of political assassinations that, I mean, imagine, if we had the equivalent of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, 2 attempts on Jerry Ford. I mean, like, there's been some of that. I don't want to minimize it, but it's just not comparable.
Sure.
But one of the other things that occurs to me is, there's been a lot of interesting reporting, some of it more suggestive than like completely nailed down, that the kids holding up the signs about settler colonialism were part of a broader network that was funded from abroad, we also had our own sort of, Trustafarian radicals here funding some of it too. And the people who are freaked out about how that's something new, I try to point out, the Iranians, they thought they could find common cause with Black Americans in the early days of the Islamic Revolution. And I think they released the Black hostages from Iran earlier to sort of send that signal that their argument wasn't with them, that kind of thing. I could have that wrong, but there was a lot of that kind of chicanery and like misunderstanding about American politics back then and trying to manipulate things. The Soviets supported all sorts of, Black nationalist movement stuff in the 1960s.
And of course, the U.S. has a long history of supporting dissident movements and rebels and changing governments also. So it's. I mean,
I kind of argue that some of the people that we're supporting, I mean, maybe not Jonah Savimbi, but like, but like the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Right. That's a bit of a different thing. But yes,
those were good guys, supporting, Radio Free Europe is a good thing, not a bad thing. And that kind of thing. But I'm just wondering how much of this stuff is encouraged by Qatar has all these campuses, American campuses in it and all that kind of stuff. Is there a follow the money or connect the dots kind of thing that one should look at?
I don't know enough about it to say. I don't know. I know there are people who are reporting, who have been reporting on this and who are reporting on, where's the funding sources. But personally, I don't know.
Yeah.
And in the book, I don't get into it at all. It's I'm just sort of sticking with the level of ideas and texts rather than who's paying for tents to protests and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I'm just kind of curious, because if, just to your point about how the political, international and domestic political climate has changed so much, the strategic calculation for some of that stuff might disappear as well. I fully credit you and the people that you're studying that there's a high level of sincerity in what they're arguing, and they're not just all agents of foreign powers. That's not the point I'm trying to make. But you often get these things where foreign powers pick people that agree with them or that are willing to carry a message, and signal boost them in certain ways. And I'm just kind of curious about that. But we'll visit that another day. Is there anything on this subject that you think I missed that you think you want to leave people with?
No, I think it's been really good conversation, and I probably should get back to my desk. So maybe we should.
Well, I know Jago has that cattle prod.
I don't actually work for Paul. I work near him, but I'm in the newsroom section, so I'm not on the op-ed page. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I just I know people live in terror. I've known Paul for 30 years, so I say it all in fun. So, Adam Kirsch, thanks again for being on The Remnant. And again, the book is on settler colonialism, ideology, violence, and justice. If you've got a friend, family member, child who annoys you at holiday dinners, and you want to be able to speak intelligently about this stuff, I cannot recommend a better book for it. So check it out. And again, Adam, thanks for being on The Remnant.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.